Now, some people might argue we take our introduction videos too seriously, but I want to say we take them just seriously enough. So, welcome to another episode of a kind of Bloggers Anonymous series we're doing to return to the art of blogging. It's called On Writing. And I am thrilled to be traveling far across the world to bring our next guest to you. This is Kate Bowles, whose writing is probably, arguably some of my favorite I've ever read on the blogosphere when it comes to higher ed and thinking through the struggles of what it means to be a kind of laborer within the system, if you will. But that's kind of going to give you this sense of this staunch communist coming at you. And that's not it. This is a full blown poet we're talking about who finds ways to kind of build the magic of the world and the life and the kind of exploration of what we're doing with the kind of real, I don't know, how would we say, glue of the system that you can get caught within. Now, before I let you talk, Kate, I just want to introduce a bit of what you're saying. Like, this is not even a post, ladies and gentlemen. This is an about page. And this is how the about page reads. You don't even need to go to a post to see how magical Kate's writing is. And I'm going to read a little bit from the about page to get us started. This is where Kate's introducing herself as an associate dean at the time. And my day job involves thinking and strategy writing in the field of internationalization of higher education in all forms. So at this point, you're like, you know what? This is a normal about page. Some of which are transformative and some of which are retail. This is university governance as crucible. Everything about higher education in general gets tested when it's thrown into the bright, hot bowl of internationalization. I mean, I don't know. I think that's a little piece of the magic you're going to find when you read Kate. And that's only from the About page. So, Kate, I know that's a kind of, as my son would say, glazing introduction, but welcome to On Writing.
Oh, thanks, Jim. It's lovely to be here.
Well, I wanted to have you on because you had a very, when I reached out to you to talk about your writing, you had a kind of a unique take, and I think we'll talk on that. But before we get to that, can you talk to me a little bit about, your kind of relationship to writing from the beginning? Like, were you always a writer? Did you always imagine yourself as a writer? Or did that come to you at a particular time? Like, what's your kind of relationship to writing from the beginning, if you will?
I, that's a great question, Jim, because when I look back, I think I possibly hoped to work within the discipline of poetry. And so when I was an undergraduate, certainly, and when I was thinking about what writing was in the world, I was thinking in the company of poets. I was thinking about how poets worked, how they put words together, how every word had to earn its keep in a certain way. Um, and I wasn't sure that I could be a poet, but I thought I wanted to be near poetry a bit. So I think I haven't thought about this for years, but when I look back, that's really what I hoped writing was for. And I suppose I'm not a poetry scholar, so I'm just going to say this as an ordinary sort of poetry reader. What I loved about poetry was that it left most things unexplained. It allowed huge space for the reader to come in and think for themselves. And I thought that was the kind of writing that I thought was really interesting. So that when I was younger, that was the kind of writing that drew me, and it probably never went away.
Now, when I first discovered deck chairs for the Titanic, right? Or music for deck chairs. I want to say deck chairs for the Titanic because that's a kind of comment that Gardner Campbell used to always make when talking about higher ed. And it's funny because I think Gardner Campbell is one of the first people who pointed me to your writing and pointed me to your blog. And one of the things that I got struck by when I went back to the blog recently to kind of see this question of music for the deck chairs is that you did have a quote on your about page to kind of explain title a bit from Thomas Hardy, who came up again a bit before we started talking. So it seems like poetry was, in fact, from the beginning, part of your imaginations of the blog. Is that true?
I sort of backed into that poem because the title came unbidden from nowhere. Um, and so I sat with the title as much as other people did. I thought to myself, what are these deck chairs? Where are they? Why is there music playing? What is this about to work in higher education and to have this feeling of a kind of grandeur that is being, that is sinking, as perhaps it should. And the poem from Thomas Hardy is about that. It's about the vaingloriousness of the Titanic that eventually sank. And so that didn't come first. That came second.
Now, when did you start music for deck chairs and why?
Oh, look, it was a way back. I was very fortunate to be working in an undergraduate program that really privileged the idea of working directly on the open web. I was surrounded by nerds and I really wasn't. I was just a writer. And so I stumbled upon WordPress, just regular old WordPress.com. And I think the reason I started writing was because I was already aware that when I wrote in a conventional academic way, it wasn't just that I was unhappy, but I was something in me was objecting to it. I think that there are people all around us who talk really elegantly about refusal. And one of the things about refusal is that you have to recognize it in yourself. And sometimes you're the last to realize that you're actually against something when you've been thinking you just can't do it. And I discovered I was sort of against academic writing, and that was tremendously awkward given the job that I was doing. And then I discovered blogging, and I really loved it. I really loved that I could write on my own platform. I wrote anonymously. Nobody knew who I was. I was quite careful about the things that I said about what was going on behind the scenes in the place that I worked. But I thought that very few people knew much about how higher education actually worked. You know, they kind of knew about academics or about teaching or about students, but they didn't really know how it was made. And I was really interested in what I was finding out about how it was made. So that would have been, I don't know, probably around 2011. I'm not sure, maybe sort of sometime. And I just wrote anonymously. I just kind of popped things out from time to time. Um, and then very unexpectedly, I was outed by The Guardian. And this was an extraordinarily awkward moment. I was in a hotel in Sweden, and a team of us had gone from my university, and we were kind of in a workshop on social media. And I was just finding my footing, sort of out in the world of that. And I saw that The Guardian had written an article about top 10 higher education bloggers in Australia, and my blog was named, and I was named as a person connected to this university. And one of the things I knew about the university that I worked at was how media monitoring worked. So I knew that this would have immediately been picked up. So I sat sort of frozen with horror in this hotel room in Sweden, thinking, oh, this is very awkward now. What do I do? And so at that point, I became more open about the things that I was saying. It was more, I became myself, really.
Now, how did that, in terms of A, how did from when you started the blog to when you get recognized by The Guardian as, top 10, top 10 in Australia, but like, did you just slowly start getting a following? How did you start connecting with other folks? And what was your voice like before the outing and after? And I'd love to know, like, did you come to the blog post Sweden and post outing and been like, this is a relief, I can finally say what I want? Or was there even more pressure?
There was definitely more pressure. And I should be clear about top 10 in Australia. I think probably at that stage there were 11 bloggers. I mean, it was kind of early.
But
So,
still, you made a top 10 list. That's everyone's dream.
and actually not at all mine. So so then I experienced a kind of throat closing stage fright and found it hard to know what to do after that now that it was me. Um, and so so did I feel more free? No. I was probably as careful as I had been for the same reason of sort of ethics, of workplace ethics. Some of the things that I could have said, and that would have been true all along, were things that I had observed because of a position that I was in that could have shown someone in a poor light. And there's no point in being that person. You know, I'm not a journalist. I'm not I wasn't kind of there uncovering tremendous things. I was just observing things and thinking about what it meant that this is how universities were actually cooking.
Well, it's interesting because you say, I was just a writer as you talk about being part of that group. And then obviously, you're just a writer becomes a kind of way of opening up how the sausage is made, so to speak, at the university. So that just a writer is kind of part of what you're talking about with blogging. And I think maybe bloggers, it's by how we work. We downplay
Yeah.
the idea of blogging because so many people are like, you're just a blogger. You're a lowly, dirty blogger. But at the same time, your experience early on with blogging was very similar to my experience early on with
Yeah.
blogging. I was in a PhD program. I was, unlike you, a terrible writer. And I struggled with that because so much of your identity is linked to what you can and can't write and how well you can and where you're published and blah blah blah. And the fact that I was given this blog or had this blog where I could write about whatever I wanted and, warts and all. And somehow there was a clan of mutants out there who would both read and respond, was as liberating a thing as I could imagine. And it sounds like early on, at least with music for deck chairs, you had a bit of that experience.
Look, I did. And so I think I became much more comfortable with writing. The process of writing got easier. I stayed pretty close to the kind of writing that I wanted to do. I thought about it. I read a lot of blogs. I was interested in the voices that seemed to me to be saying something that I wanted to connect to or point to. And I think one of the things I loved about blogging was that you could point to something that someone else had written and someone could easily go there. There was none of this kind of um, dealing with paywalls or you have to go and get this journal article out to see what I've cited. And anyway, I'm showing you what I've cited because look at me. You could just say, hey, I think you should see what Audrey's writing about this because it's really important. Or why don't you go and see what Jim has said? And it was a very fertile time for writing. And there was a fertile culture of commenting. So it was a conversation. And people would swing by the blog and they would say something to me, and I would swing by. Probably one of the first blogs that I read really deeply was Jonathan Rees. I would swing by Jonathan's blog and have something to say because I disagreed with him about quite a few things. And I really found it engaging that the conversation seemed to me to be worth having. Um, and, working in a very small regional university within a very small national university sector, this gave me access to a series of conversations that were in themselves very, very small, one on one, like this. But I could have a natter to someone on the other side of the world, and that was pretty great. So I think for me, the early part of the blog was that, and it would have trundled along like that for some time. Um, and I was interested in labour issues, and that could have got a bit, as you say, incoming communist. Although, not there's anything wrong with that,
No, I
but
love communists too. Don't get me wrong.
but it could have got a bit like that, and but it didn't because the way that I got kind of propelled into that second stream of writing, which was writing a shared blog with someone else about casual labour issues in universities, and no one was really writing about that in Australia at the time. I got into that because I was thinking about the problem of labour in universities. All of the thinking I'd done about systems really kept bringing me back to that one core thing: this is broken. And I think what brought me a bigger audience at that moment wasn't that I was writing about labour, but that I was writing about illness. And people had an interest in reading about the fact that I'd been diagnosed with an illness. I was writing about labour. I was diagnosed with cancer on National Go Home on Time Day. And that was what the blog post was about. On National Go Home on Time Day, I discovered that I had cancer and that this was much worse than it needed to be because I had delayed a referral by 12 months because I was too busy trying to manage a higher education job. And I thought that was worth writing about. I thought it was important for people working in universities to think about what they were being asked to do with all of the extra time that they were putting in and where it was being taken from. But people swung around the topic of cancer very quickly, and that was quite surprising to me because in some ways that was the more ordinary part of it. But because that took me out of work for 6 months, I really had nothing to do but write then, because I couldn't really do very much because I was quite unwell. And so then I found a colleague who was also thinking about casualisation of labour, or adjunctification, as you'd say, in the US system. And we started a blog on that topic. And that, I think, was, for me, a completely different kind of writing. It was much more of a kind of news roundup. Here's what's happening. Here's why this is a problem. But I think at the same time, on my main blog, a lot of people were interested in reading about what it was like to suddenly receive a cancer diagnosis. And I just hoped to leave the message that the problem wasn't the cancer diagnosis, the problem was the 12-month delay in following up on the original referral, and that was a structural problem for higher education. So that's how we get past that little middle bit.
But it's also, I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting about the way you frame it, and it's again, my experience really tracks with yours, is coming to graduate school at the City University of New York, and the first thing it's like, here's your syllabus. You're gonna you teach in the College of Staten Island. Good luck. I know you can't afford New York, but we need you because you're cheap labor. And
Yeah.
you know, obviously there's a sense not only of dealing with questions that other people aren't, and higher ed is completely blind to the hierarchical structure that is built on and it made possible, and you know that better than me. But like the other pieces, your writing is, and this has come up again and again in this discussion when we're talking about blog, is really authentic. Like it comes across, and people might say, what does that mean to be authentic or to be real? But like, I feel like when I'm reading Music for Deck Chairs, you're talking to me, right? And I don't know if that's just voice. I don't know if that's artifice, right? When you're a really good writer, maybe someone could do that. But I think that was why people came back. That is probably why people read so assiduously, is that you were opening up and you were being who you are online, which a lot of people doubted was even possible.
Oh, look, some of that is to do with the way that academic writing explicitly discourages all of that. And I think now we're much better within the academy at acknowledging positionality, at saying that it makes a difference. And I really want to credit the work of, feminist writers in saying we can't pretend that there is some uniform and yet somehow anonymous we that writes everything and comes to a sort of uniform standpoint about things. That you see what you see, you are who you are, and you should say it because you should be. It's not so much authentic. You should be frank. You should just be frank about the position that you hold because it will explain to your reader why your view on a topic might be limited um, rather than expansive. So I think I was probably, as much as anything, trying to be really clear about the perspective that I took belonged to a person, and that was all it was.
And quite refreshing. I mean, in just terms of a connection and a space. So here we are. You're in your blog now. You're kind of deep into your blog. You've been writing for years at that point. But one of the things that we discussed before starting this session is, you haven't been writing
Yep.
for a number of years now. And I think you nailed it, and whatever you say I'm kind of on board with, because I love the way you articulate and I love your ideas. So I'm easy. I'm not that smart. But what does it mean when we're doing a kind of series on writing, and we're kind of promoting and rah-rah on blogging? What does it mean when one has been blogging and stopped? Like, what does that look like, and what does that tell us, to your point that you made about writing?
Look, I've been thinking about this, Jim. Um, Something I learned, a lesson I learned very deeply when I was working in oral history of people's memories of going to cinemas. The story about cinema going is always everyone went to the movies. And so we chased around and we got lots of people to talk to us about their memories of movie going. And I was really fortunate to be mentored by an extraordinary thinker in this field, Bobby Allen, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And Bobby said one day, actually, we should think a lot more about people who didn't go to the movies, because everything about the audience experience, the experience of cinema that we were trying to capture, presumed that the people who didn't go were not part of the shape that the audience took. But in fact, they were entirely the reason why the audience had the social composition that it did. And I've never forgotten that advice. I think it stands up in a lot of situations. Thinking about writing means thinking about not writing. In the same way that a really good painter will tell you that the shape of a thing is really the shape of the space around the thing. And so, uh, when I think when COVID hit us all at once, everything everywhere all at once, a lot of people said, all of a sudden, I can't write. And I was one. I stopped. I wrote 2 or 3 posts about the beginning of COVID. I think my last piece of writing was about the first heralding of open AI. And then that was it, done.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was very early on, and you were talking about bikes and how, the e-bikes and AI somehow had this relationship, which was brilliant as usual, your metaphors.
But I think that I then became very interested in how many people were also saying the same thing. How many people I'd really followed as writers stopped, and stopped at about the same time. And I thought about I thought about overload. I thought, are we all just overloaded? Our circuits have all just blown. Um, did we all become whoever we were on a journey to becoming when we first were writing? Did we all become something else? So many people went into administration, and I was in, an administrative role that required me to do a lot of writing, a lot of writing of the kind that can sometimes inhibit other kinds of writing, not academic writing, but bureaucratic writing. Lots and lots and lots of the kind of writing that ChatGPT can honestly have, the writing that doesn't need a human to do it in the first place. But I had to do a lot of that. Um, but I think something else happened that I still can't figure out. It's like that moment when gardeners all say, "Have you noticed there are no bees?" And no one can figure out where the bees went. And a lot of bloggers were saying, I can't do it. I just can't. I don't know what I'm doing. And as I had always written, because I knew what I was up to, I then found I also didn't know really what I was doing. So I stopped. I don't think I meant to stop. I think I stopped and didn't start again. I think I always thought I was going to start again in a minute. And you would know, Jim, that what then happened was a whole lot of losing my password. I would come back to the blog and find that I'd locked myself out of it. Then I would get sad. Then I would go away. And by that time, the thing that I had thought of that I might want to put a thought together about was gone. And the administrative job kept saying, but you could write this briefing note, or you could write this report, or you could write another 20 emails. You could just do that instead. And all of those were careful kinds of bureaucratic writing. They had to be well written. there was a lot of editing, there was a lot of thinking, and my writing brain gradually became that writing brain instead. Um, so so it's only very recently, really just moments before you contacted me, that I had started to think, independent of you contacting me, I should I should think about how to get myself out of this, because I'm no longer working in higher education, which is a tremendous blessing. And one of the things that I would really like to do is find my voice again. So that is what's underway right at the moment. Is that is that search for a voice um, that might be different, it might be similar, but it would need to have a way of thinking. So Jimmy, you would have seen that I was very taken with something that was on Mastodon uh, yesterday from Jackie Alcine, and I've got his permission to use his name. And
Great.
I hope to point people in the direction of this beautiful essay about what is the point of blogging. That's not the only thing the essay is about. And he cites Ethan Marcotte's idea of the blog as a worry stone. And Jackie himself writes about blogging as auto chattering. And I was just really struck by all of this, because this is a tech writer. This is someone who doesn't write what I think about. So it was really engrossing to me to read all of it. And I want to think a lot about this question of the worry stone that gets right back to where I began, which is the little stone in my pocket turning over and over again. Just what is this I am thinking about? And how do I hold it? That is really where the worry stone took me. How do I hold it at human scale? Because since that moment of wondering whether OpenAI was going to prove like some kind of e-bike, OpenAI is everywhere, and e-bikes are also everywhere. And I don't know how we return to the gait, the human gait of writing as walking, when e-bikes are everywhere. And I'm thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And I mean, the worry stone idea is amazing because, I
Isn't
just
it?
think about every post as, my thumb up against that rock. And then
Yeah.
maybe after 20, 30, whatever, amount of posts or years, or however you track, import, like you make a little indent. And that indent is, your considerations over time and interactions. And I love that, obviously, because, I like you struggle with, what am I writing about now? Like, why am I even doing this? And part of it is habit, but part of it is that, I think desperate sense of like, I still want to connect with those people. Like, I still want to have a sense of interaction. In fact, I believe that's part of what's undergirding the On Writing series is to try and reach out to folks like you. And you thinking about blogging again is probably the best news I've heard all year. And, what does it mean to make connections, especially when we're up against these platforms that seem to have not only controlled our or taken control of our voices in terms of ownership, but even the way in which we connect now. And I really wonder, can we, in a small scale, like you're talking about with that pebble in your pocket, reclaim a little bit of those discussions and those relations. And I think it's got to be intentional. I really think we just have to dig in and try and do it, even if it fails.
I, this is so interesting, Jim, because I think it takes us to something that isn't being talked about very much in this question of writing, which is writing back. So, our peerless friend, Alan Levine, who is so beautiful in his intentional practice of commentary. He comments, he brings a conversation where there was really just a half formed thought. There was someone kind of standing in an empty room clutching a pebble. And Alan comes in and says, "Whoa, let's have a think about this." And you think, oh, now we have a conversation. This is really good. I've been wondering whether some of the longer form replacements for Twitter, and I'm particularly thinking now here about the Fediverse, the fact that the Fediverse allows for longer writing, has created some kind of call and response capability that we don't yet know what to do with. We're sort of like those shepherds that can call across enormous distances with whistles. We're kind of whistling and calling and hoping, and then someone calls back. And it's kind of marvelous, not only because someone heard you, but because the calling back articulates the distance between here and there. It locates you in a way that I think, whales understand, but humans understand very badly. And when you have been located in relation to another, I think something profound happens with the attention that you pay to the responsibility that you have to speak, to use your voice to help others locate themselves wherever they are. And when blogging became a fancy way of just publishing an endless stream of op-eds, and I think this is what Jackie is kind of grieving, that sense of auto chattering, becoming just self-propelling talk. You miss what happens when someone walks in and says, I was just here. I was just here. I just saw this. I saw you. And I'm going on my way. You don't have to deal with me forever. I'm not now living in your house. But I know that you were there and I was just here. I really love that.
Well, it's interesting to me that you should talk about the Fediverse, and I always say that. It's interesting to me. I got to find a new introduction, like to the way in which I make a point. In fact, I don't know what I do. Fascinatingly enough, as it turns out, I'm working on these rhetorical skills. See, I'm a blogger. I'm not
Yeah,
a
you
guy
are.
who does video, and I'm a bad blogger, and I proudly do it. But my point is, when you talk about the Fediverse, you were one of the first people, as I dabbled in there in 2022, 2023, as it was starting to, Twitter was starting to fully implode and people were jumping ship. And I jumped onto Mastodon, set up a small server, and you were one of the first people to welcome me to my new home on the Fediverse. You were absolutely like, you're going to enjoy this space. It's a very different pace. Enjoy the silence at times that comes with it. And that's why I've never thought of you as stopping writing or stopping blogging. Maybe it's not happening on Music for Deck Chairs for now, but you're very much a crucial part of my reading when I'm on Mastodon and when I'm looking at conversations that are happening, like you're saying, this echolocation between points. You're a big point in that relationship. And so it doesn't seem like you've stopped writing in my mind. It seems like you're exploring, a social network that maybe puts people, front and center and gives them a little bit more independence. So I do see that you're pushing on that sense of the Fediverse as a new place to relocate our discussions.
Look, it's an interesting one, Jim. When you showed up there, I had gone in an earlier wave in 2016, so quite early. And I went in the company of a bunch of academics, almost all of whom left. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. And one of the reasons it's really interesting is that all the academics just left. So that seems good. That's already a step forward for me. And I stayed there and thought, please, please don't find it. Because I was really enjoying the relief of being away from the shouty, look at me, here's my latest publication thing. But I did also notice what a longer character limit made possible, and that there were people there writing in really interesting ways, doing interesting things with writing that allowed for a more tentative philosophy of writing rather than here is this complete thing, I'm ready to publish it. There was just a tentative philosophy of putting something out there and you could, say something or not. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot wrong. A lot of, no, wrong, that's the wrong word. There is a lot that is troubling about any large social network of strangers who have to figure out how to get along really, really suddenly. And some mistakes have definitely been made, but the federation of it interests me a lot. Because the other experience that I'd had like that was I was part of Mike Caulfield's Federated Wiki. And that was a very brief, for me, absolutely shaping experience. That was where, in that brief 2 weeks that Mike and Ward Cunningham put together, that experiment in co-writing of things that you kind of borrowed from the table next to you, put in yours, but the table next to you was sort of it was intact, and all of this. I think that was the closest that I've come to, this is a ridiculous word, but a kind of ecstatic experience of writing. Um, Absolutely absorbed for reasons I've never been able to explain. I found that particular kind of co-writing drew out of me writing that I was not expecting. Um, and that's led me back to where I am now. I've just suddenly become very interested in a form of writing that I've only just discovered, even though it's been around for a very long time, which is people writing in multiples of 100 words. So there's a publication, well-known publication by two really fine scholars called The Hundreds, where they write to each other, and you can either write 100 words or you can write multiples of 100 words, but not, you can't write 130 words. If you're going to go over 100, you have to get to 200. And it's a really exacting form of writing, and I've just started doing it. And they say in their sort of essay about writing the hundreds that they picked it up from someone else. So it's got a bit of a pedigree. What I find about that is that it brings back the concentration that I found in thinking about poetry. You can't just run on, you know, if you're sort of at 98 words or 102 words, you're sort of not done. And that means that you have to think like someone cutting a diamond a bit more than normally. You can't just kind of throw something out there and say, okay, done. And I'm finding that is helping me write. Um, so something about that, and I do it with another person. So something about that exchange of ideas. Well, it's not even an exchange of ideas, because the kind of principle is that you don't respond to the other person's thing. You know, the other person writes 100 words, you write 100 words, done. And I'm finding I can do it. I'm like someone on an elderly bicycle with the e-bikes kind of going past me. And I'm just discovering that balance on a bicycle is a form of embodied memory. It's quite good to be moving.
Yeah, and again, that recurring theme for you seemingly of poetry, right? Like that idea of wanting to, you said, I don't know, be close to poetry somehow in your
Yeah,
career. Like that idea of poetry adjacent
yeah,
is interesting in that, because it absolutely came out on music for deck chairs, but as a way of kind of getting back into that. And that's a big thing for me with reading. I went through a pretty dark depression over a year ago, and like I had to almost like train myself as a form of reading to get out of it. And I had found that my reading skills, because I had spent so much time reading in different ways, that when I dig into a novel of some import, right, like I am having to read the page 3 or 4 times. I don't know if that's age, I don't know if that's abilities, like I might be on my own kind of old person e-bike too, but I'm trying to wonder, like, the impulse to, like you said, this back and forth. This, I really like this idea of echolocating other folks in the network. Because people talk about it a lot. I'd love to get your opinion is, are we in a situation with kind of post-platform fracturing? And we're looking for the places in which we connect, because people have said it on this series again and again. They're like, I love blogging, I continue to blog, but the conversation isn't there. I got to go somewhere else for that conversation. And, Alan, who you brought up, we'll talk about that again. Like, where's everybody gone? The last of the Blowhekins, right? And the idea of like, no one else is blogging or commenting, maybe save him. So how do you understand as the Fediverse as a solution for that? as that fabric of connecting? Do you see that's just the world we live in? Is there a way of maybe reclaiming any of that?
Look, this is very interesting. I don't, I mean, I honestly don't know. I think that any large social network is going to immediately run into versions of the same problems that all of them run into, which is establishing good standards for safety and respect, establishing ways in which people who are radically unlike each other can nonetheless coexist. And at the same time, you can have some standards to say, not that, that actually doesn't help anyone without becoming Lord of the Flies. And all of that is very complicated. So I don't really want to put all of this on whether or not social networks are going to figure themselves out in their fractured form, because there are people with really deep expertise in community platform moderation, and I listen to what they have to say about how that's going to work. Was the answer, as it appeared for a while, that everyone would dive into their own Discord and then they would just kind of talk to their friends? Um, how 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 do we speak above the terrible monotone of AI produced writing, which has completely neglected what AI produced writing does to human readers, which is really turn your brain to soup? How do we speak in this world about the things that when they are read, they are useful to someone? They don't. I mean, it's useful to one person will do. What Jackie Alcine wrote on his blog was useful to me. I wrote to him to let him know it was useful to me. Is is that going to be some forms of echolocation are territorial and consistent, and some are momentary, the way that a stranger kind of picks up your hat in the street and you never see each other again. And others are, at this point in my journey, every day I see the same person and we smile. I don't know. Jim, this is really getting at the heart of the future of the human, not human writing, but human anything. Um, can we organize ourselves enough to be worth um, saving? This is a serious existential question at the moment. I don't know. The politics of hearing from one another are very, very noisy and fractured at the moment, and there are so many things that we have to reckon with at the same time. That is very daunting, how much we have to think about. The process that you describe of having to read the page over and over again, I absolutely recognize you're not alone. I'm exactly the same. How do we understand why that is happening? Um, I I don't know. My son works as a barista, and when he comes back from work every day, he empties his pockets, and his pockets are full of tiny scraps of paper on which he has handwritten things. And then he just kind of puts them, I don't know where he puts them. I don't know what he's writing. But I observe the human effort to write things down. He is writing by hand on the back of, till receipts. What's that? I want to know what that is for all of us. What survives above the kind of terrible hum of AI? What survives of our human voices? I think it matters.
Now, you on Mastodon once again, and it was one of a thrill for me, I have to admit. You've done it for many people. You'll read something, I imagine, and you'll tag it on Mastodon, writing worth reading.
Yeah.
And you basically just a quick, very kind of, I like it. It's kind of like you said, that passerby, I was here and I'm moving on. But like I read your stuff and it mattered to me. And
Yeah.
thank you. Like you're doing a lot of things subtly all at once with that writing worth reading. And things like that remind me of the community I want to be a part of, right? Like, I don't want to be dictated or lectured to. None of us really do usually when we find ourselves blogging. But we want to be in some kind of conversation where, it's not as divisive as it seems to get on these networks, but there is space to disagree and there is space to believe your own thing and inject your own feelings about where things are going and why. And that writing worth reading was, it was a reminder to me that simple acts sometimes are what make a community of any kind work.
Look, to me, the community that we belong to, it, diverse and extraordinary as it is the community of people who are currently living. That's actually the one really big thing we all have in common, alive right now. And I was so struck when I was in cancer treatment. I read, like, everyone does, Audre Lorde's cancer journals, where she says this really simple, astonishing thing that none of us have 300 years. And as soon as you say that, and you think the time is presently coming when all of us currently living won't be living, we will be the people who have gone. That means that at any moment we can acknowledge each other just through the fact of still being here today, possibly not here tomorrow, but we can say today, I see you, I hear you, I saw you did that. I saw that thing you did. And we may never meet, our paths may never cross, we may not know each other beyond this hello, but the thing we have in common is that we are living. And that in itself is just extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary. And I think possibly writing for me connects very deeply to this idea of revering our mortality, not running from it, but absolutely revering it. It is so extraordinary that our lives are so short. Almost everything I can see in the room behind you, Jim, is capable of outliving you by a very long way. Same with everything here. Um,
This was going great until you said that.
Sorry. But what if we really love this about ourselves? What if we absolutely love our living status enough to say, while I'm here, I'd like to say that I read the thing that you wrote. I thought it was really worth it. Not, I'm not running around with like a sticker going, this, Kate like this. Just, I heard it, I read it. It came into my life and it interrupted my day. How about that?
It's wonderful.
For that to be possible, both of us have to be kind of living at this moment.
Yeah, and I think we forget that. And then there's a
Yeah.
lot of forgetting it for very good reason because of all the other things we're asked to worry about and told on and struggle with. And you're saying this reminds me of a genre of blog post that I've read pretty early on, where people are blogging after they've died. Like there's that last blog post where and Darren Barefoot, who was a blogger from Canada, who I had kind of come into contact with. I didn't really know very well, but I come into contact with him when he was running the Northern Voice conference, where it's kind of my first blogging conference. It's where I kind of found my voice, to be honest. And he wrote a blog post not that long ago, a couple of years ago, where he had been terminally ill. And he wrote a blog post that just I keep on thinking about. I wouldn't say daily, but regularly, where
Yeah.
he's reflecting on like all the things he appreciated about his life and the relationships he had and the connections he had. It was a joyful post. I mean, I don't know how
Yeah.
you write such a joyful thing as you're looking into what's to come in another reality. But that one really, I mean, I didn't expect to go there, but like that one
Yeah.
really, I struggle with that a little bit because I would love to have the courage to be so joyful about something that is so, I don't know, unknown, uncertain,
Oh,
strange, alien, if you will.
well, yes. I mean, I think that. we all spend time thinking, well, what will happen? Not what will happen in the spiritual sense. I don't mean that at all. But this will all go on, and I will stop going on, and other people around me will stop going. We'll all take our turn, and we'll go. How do you settle with that? And this is something I used to think about a lot while thinking about how universities are put together, is that so many businesses, so many sectors that you and I are interested in, ed tech, for heaven's sake, um, are premised on the idea that what we're all doing now is kind of important and has a capacity to latch on to a sort of posterity. And really, we we seem to downplay the idea that the most important thing here is us because we are living. So instead we worry about not living. We feel that not living would be some kind of catastrophe. And this is why all of those people in Silicon Valley are investing in longevity research, which seems to me the most ridiculous enterprise, really. Because what we should be doing instead is kind of saying, this is what makes us marvelous. This is actually what makes us really astonishing, is that we are here. How extraordinary. So I don't know. I don't think it takes courage. I think it takes curiosity. It takes wonder. And maybe for me, Jim, writing was always, and I think might be again, about wonder, rather than about content. I was never very good at content, interested in content, and like you, not very good at consuming content, except in very, very brief, tissue thin form. But I think wonder is a very human capacity. And maybe as writers, we hold that space for that wonder to be important. I think that's worth it.
I think you are wonderful in every sense of that
Back at you.
word. Talking to you like this is just magic. And it reminds me of all the things that I mean that absolutely, that I tried to do this for and why I love it and why I keep doing it. So, Kate, as the dog is giving you the applause that you deserve, thank you so much for joining us on Writing and for being ever thoughtful, meditative, and just in your own way, truly joyful about what this whole process means. And I will be ecstatic to use that term again if you start blogging again because I'm a big fan. But I'm also a big fan on Mastodon or wherever you are. So you do what you do, no pressure.
Well, back at you, Jim. You have fished me out of the WordPress pond so many times. So if anything appears on the blog, actually, it is entirely due to you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, in fact. And with that, thanks again for another episode of On Writing. Big fan.